Welcome to Congo for the Taking. My name is Greg Hunter. To what extent was imperial policy in Congo based on idealism or realism? Idealism. The international system can be lawful. All states can and should act to enhance international law, global cooperation, universal justice, peace, and human rights. International law based on sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, the right of self-determination. Realism. The international system is anarchic. International law, as it is practiced, is a reflection of power. All states do and should act to expand their power, economic interests, and geostrategic interests. Realism was summarized by Thucydides. Justice, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. We will look at these events and try to discern the actual motives of the imperial powers. King Leopold of Belgium's Congo was considered a model of idealism. King Leopold was given Congo as his personal colony. He set up a non-profit organization, the International African Association, to protect the Congolese from the Arab slave trade and to help them develop their economy. His work appeared to be paying off, as he said, where formerly the natives hardly knew how to get their daily food, now European enterprise has brought them unthought-of wealth. E.D. Morel worked as a clerk for Leopold in Antwerp. Can you explain his puzzle? He noticed vast quantities of ivory and rubber were coming from the Congo, but very little trading goods were sent in return. Hint: only arms, ammunition, and chains were sent. Did you guess that Leopold was enslaving the natives? He eventually discovered that the International African Association was a cover for the for-profit and plunder International Congo Society, which cleverly used the same flag.
They would go into village after village. The army would seize the women of the village and hold them hostage in order to force the men of each village to go into the forest and gather a monthly quota of wild rubber. And they did this for about 20 years. And you can just very easily imagine if you have a village where the women are all being held hostage, the men are all in the forest as forced laborers for several weeks out of each month. There's nobody to plant and harvest food, to go hunting, to go fishing, to do all the normal things through which a community feeds itself. So from all of these causes, starvation, being worked to death, and most of all from the disease that hit this famine-ridden population, the best estimates are that between 1880, when King Leopold first got his hands on the Congo, and 1920, that in that 40-year period, the population was slashed from about 20 million at the beginning of that period to around 10 million at the end.
In the book The Heart of Darkness, the author Joseph Conrad, who witnessed the violence in the Congo, writes, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much."
Leopold's Congo, an ostensible model of idealism, was actually a model of crass realism. As Conrad said, "The conquest of the earth is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." Belgium granted independence to Congo in 1960.
Gentlemen, the independence of the Congo is the crowning moment of the mission conceived by the genius of King Leopold II, undertaken by him with courageous tenacity and pursued with great perseverance by Belgium.
Whose perspective most accurately describes this event? Baudouin or Conrad? Idealism or realism?
King Baudouin made a speech in which he exalted the role of Belgium, talking about everything Belgium had brought to the Congo. He said we had arrived at a moment when Belgium had decided to grant the Congo its independence, and that this was well and good. I would say it was a classic speech for such circumstances. Kasavubu made a speech thanking King Baudouin. He talked about the Congo and the future. It was a good speech, too. Lumumba hadn't been scheduled to speak. The whole international press was there. Suddenly he got up, walked to the tribune, and made a speech.
Lumumba's speech came as a shock. Nobody was expecting it, and it shocked lots of Belgians. He systematically condemned Belgian colonization. He repeated all the harshest anti-colonial accusations. We'd cut off people's hands, we'd enslaved them, and all that sort of thing.
You who have fought for independence and are today victorious, I salute you in the name of the Congolese government. I salute all my friends who fought relentlessly at our sides. We have been subjected to insults and sarcasms, to the blows we had to endure from morning to night just because we were Africans. We learned that the law was never the same according to whether it was applied to whites or blacks. Who will ever forget the shootings or the barbarous jail cells awaiting those who refuse to submit to this regime of injustice, oppression, and exploitation?
That was really the decisive moment when he made that famous speech on the 30th of June 1960. A lot of people then said he signed his death warrant with that speech because the Belgian government didn't want him. Not just because of the 30th of June speech, but because he was Patrice Lumumba, and he didn't fit in with the hopes of the Belgians and Americans and many people in business.
A show of idealism, but actually the realism expressed by Belgian officers who warned their Congolese troops. Avant indépendance est équivalent à après indépendance. Baudouin or Conrad? Belgian paratroopers arrived to quell the Congo revolt.
Only 5 days after the founding of the new state, a revolt broke out in the army. The black troops rebelled against their Belgian officers who had no intention of abandoning their command. Crisis in the Congo took over the headlines in the world's press.
In diesem Wagen wurde der italienische Konsul in Leopoldville ermordet.
The Italian consul in Leopoldville was murdered in this car. Terror and destruction are now the features of a freedom which many believe to be premature. Whites are fleeing mobs who have been whipped up to anger. The Belgian government is sending paratroops into the Congo.
In the copper-rich province of Katanga, Lumumba's opponent, Chombi, called on the Belgians for help too, in order to disarm the troops. Less than 10 days after their withdrawal, colonial soldiers triumphantly returned to the former colony. René Smol went to Katanga as an officer in the military secret service.
If it hadn't been for the courage of that small number of Belgian officers and NCOs in containing the blacks and preventing them from overrunning the town, then it would have been horrible.
The Elizabethville mutiny was over in 24 hours thanks to the Belgians.
White mercenaries came to help and proclaimed their idealistic motives.
Well, I come from Johannesburg, South Africa, and I think the reason why I joined this outfit is I think it's about high time that communism was stopped in the Congo.
I come from Vereniging, South Africa. I joined the army for 3 reasons. Firstly, for the money, secondly, to fight communism, and thirdly, for the adventure.
I joined the Congolese army because I am in favor of Mr. Tsombi, and then to get away from the wife and my mother-in-law.
Interestingly, the Navy SEAL who coordinated the Tonkin Gulf provocations against North Vietnam that resulted in what we know as the Vietnam War was hired by the CIA to command swift boats in Congo to fight Congolese rebels. He praised the courage, determination, and idealism of the mercenaries he commanded. Were these soldiers and mercenaries fighting for idealist or realist aims?
This was the Katangan secession. Chombi, known locally as Mr. Cash Register, declared himself president of the separatist province. But he was a president installed by the Belgians.
Elizabethville was above all a center for important financial interests. That was where the Union Minière, the mining company, was. Obviously, Belgian financial circles also wanted to keep their hands on that.
One of the major figures in the breakaway state was the Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Kibwe.
As soon as we took over, the mining company, l'Union Minière, continued to export copper, and the revenue from this went into the Katanga National Bank.
Chombi's chief aide was a Belgian lawyer, Jacques Barteloos.
The mining company now paid its taxes and license fees to the Katangan government, not to Leopoldville. So the Katangans had plenty of money, and this enabled them to equip the Katangan gendarmes and buy weapons and armored vehicles. There were arms merchants continually visiting Chombi's home to try and sell him arms.
Chombi's white mercenaries defending the free world in the heart of Africa soon became known as les affreux, literally the dreadful men.
They're all ex-something, ex-anti-guerrilla fighters from French Algeria, British Malaysia, Borneo, or Kenya, ex-SS officers from Germany, ex-CIA pilots from Cuba, ex-farmers from Kenya, ex-residents of the Sudan, Egypt, Tanganyika, ex-students from South Africa and southern Rhodesia. Some follow a macabre ideal of glory and adventure. Some believe they're fighting a last-ditch battle against communism. Some are known as les affreux, the horrors, who just love war.
The former Navy SEAL also commanded mercenaries enlisted by former SAS officer Mad Mike Hoare. He described them as undisciplined, untrainable, untrustworthy, marauding bandits, and suspected it was they who stole one of his swift boats. Notice the USAID supplied Jeep. By law, USAID can support freedom fighters, but not terrorists. Let's pause the Congo narrative and discuss mercenaries for a moment. How do we personally decide who are freedom fighters and who are terrorists? Are our perspectives reasoned, or have they been manipulated by propaganda promoting our country's realist aims? What did Reagan call the Contras? The moral equivalent of our founding fathers. What did Canada's foreign minister say about the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, an Al-Qaeda offshoot in Libya? Has a strong dedication to democracy. Do you remember the Mujahideen? They were freedom fighters against the Russians in Afghanistan and against the Serbs in Bosnia. Then in the late 90s, they became Al-Qaeda terrorists, but were rehabilitated, in the media at least, in Libya and Syria. Who were the freedom fighters in Rwanda in 1994? Paul Kagame's RPF. Officially, financially, and politically, they are still supported by our government and in many of our minds, even after committing mass murder in Congo. Marlowe describes what Kurtz had scribbled on his idealistic-sounding pamphlet. At the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you. Exterminate all the brutes. Who are today's valiant freedom fighters? What do you think? Would this be an informative project or discussion for a social studies class? Do you recognize this famous guerrilla fighter? No. Surprising. He's very famous. How about here? Che Guevara. Now, in Congo, was he a freedom fighter or a terrorist? Well, it depends whom you ask. Mandela and Mobutu had very different opinions. Was he in Congo on an idealist or realist mission? Perhaps the best one could say is it was very unrealistic idealism. Whose perspective most accurately describes the motives of UN peacekeepers in Congo? Baudouin or Conrad? Idealism or realism? Were they there to protect the sovereignty of Congo or the realist interests of the imperial powers? Would you believe Che Guevara? Or a member of the Politburo?
UN troops were supposed to protect the independence of Congo, but they would not allow the Congolese troops, which were loyal to Lumumba, to operate. The mission of the United Nations troops was misused to topple the regime of the government of Lumumba.
No? Would you believe the Africa specialist on the United States National Security Council?
The Soviets were backing Lumumba. So President Eisenhower said, well, we may have to use NATO there to keep the Soviets out. But finally, cooler heads prevailed, and they asked the UN Security Council to send a peacekeeping operation to the Congo. President Eisenhower made some very basic policies which are still in existence today. And he said that if there are troubles in Africa, we don't want to have to send troops there, or Europeans should not send troops. It should all be done by the UN.
Lumumba thought that the arrival of the UN peacekeepers would help him bring stability. He was wrong. The UN mission provided the missing ingredient to oust his government. Lumumba had just promoted his personal secretary, Joseph Mobutu, to Army Chief of Staff. Mobutu was to coordinate with the UN troops to stop the country's descent into anarchy. Instead, he turned to Larry Devlin.
Mobutu said that the army was very unhappy with the prime minister because he was turning the army over to the Soviets. He wanted to mount a coup d'etat, but there was one condition. They had to know that they would have the support of the United States government. I had tried and failed to achieve by legal means what they wanted, the United States government wanted. So I stood up and shook his hand. Finally, it took me a while to do this, and said, I guarantee you the support of the United States government.
This book describes the CIA's plan to poison Lumumba. And this book describes Western and United Nations complicity in his assassination. From Heart of Darkness. We won't be free from unfair competition till one of these fellows is hanged for an example, he said. Certainly, grunted the other. Get him hanged. Why not? Anything can be done in this country. Baudouin or Conrad? Idealism or realism? What were the motives of UN peacekeepers in Congo?